Hello, folks. This is my next Trump era podcast, and it might be a little bit of a long one. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself, briefly. Many of you will know, if you found me through Facebook, that I have certain libertarian credentials. Basically, I learned about Soviet economic history, Soviet history in general, but especially economic history, and started to question sort of the way that I was raised, which was more socialist, and became quite a significantly libertarian-leaning Austrian economist through that. And I worked at the Heritage Foundation for 5 years, and I have written many books and papers explaining how the Austrian model is a better model, why supply and demand is so important, how messed up the Soviet Union was economically, as well as in terms of freedom, and so on and so forth. So, and I maintain everything that I said in terms of its factual basis in reality, with the sort of caveat that I think there were certain things maybe missing, sort of left out from that analysis. So I don't think that anything I said was wrong. I just think that maybe there are some things that weren't considered in that. So I'm a little bit more moderate than I used to be, but I believe that I could be said to have libertarian credentials. Okay, that said, now let's talk about what I want to talk about today, which is the Trump administration and why libertarians should be very, very anti-Trump. So, when I speak to a lot of libertarians online, on Facebook and stuff, they have said that sure, Trump says a lot of obnoxious things, stupid things, even racist things, and even authoritarian-sounding things, but that's just talk. You know, he's trying to get under the skin of the left, or he just enjoys speaking out like that, being politically incorrect, but his actions are something else. He's great in his actions. He deregulates. He's less authoritarian and corrupt and dangerous than, say, Obama was, and so on. They say past presidents have been worse, sometimes naming presidents from many decades ago in order to find worse ones to compare him with. Let's try not to compare with presidents from the 60s or earlier to find worse actions, because a lot has happened since then. And I would hope we're supposed to be trying to be getting better. So I will stipulate now that presidents from the 60s and earlier may have done worse things than Trump. I mean, if you go back even further, you'll find presidents who favored slavery, right? That's not the point. And although conservatives like to look back and find some good from the past, and the founding fathers did write an amazing set of founding documents, right? But those documents were something to live up to. Okay, if we had made no changes to culture, to laws, to legislation, to the Constitution itself in the form of amendments, then today only white property-owning men would be able to vote. And black people, men, women, and children, would still be the property of white men. And white women would have so few rights, not only not having the right to vote, but so few rights that they would basically be property of those white men. So the founding documents were and are excellent. Okay? But they are something we must keep working to put into practice. They are something to live up to. They were not implemented perfectly at the time, and therefore looking back to previous presidents, the further back that you go, the more problems that there are, and we're hoping that we're actually eliminating those problems. Okay? And this whole idea of make America great again and go back to the past is not something that true libertarians should really be thinking in terms of. Libertarians should be thinking about how we can become a more free society, a society with greater rights for people. Even if that means rolling back some of what the left has done, it doesn't mean going back to a previous time. Because the previous time when taxes were lower, and in some ways things might have been better, in other ways things were much, much worse. There were huge swaths of the population that didn't have basic rights. Okay, so we're not going back, we're going forward, even if by going forward we need to roll back some of what was put into place. Got me? Okay. Okay, so I gotta say it's a surprise to me that the libertarians who I know through Facebook or in person have been so supportive of Trump. Now, it's not to say they all have, certainly not, but many of them, many libertarians I know seem to think that Trump is the better of two evils or whatever. They still are seeing the Democrats as being worse. And this is what I want to address. And I'm going to assume that they're all coming from a good place, that they're good faith actors, that they believe exactly what they say they believe. Because many of these people are academics, are very smart, and are good people, I believe, and do believe what they say. So why do I say that Trump is so dangerous? Why do I say that Trump is making things worse from a libertarian point of view? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, and why I see it as a top priority that we get rid of him. Okay, and most of it comes down to basics to do with the institutions of America, the founding documents, and the like. And why I think that libertarians should be at the forefront of the never again Trump movement to get rid of him, perhaps to join with the Lincoln Project to make sure that he's gone. Okay? And I'll explain why. But I will name a number of different types of things that I think libertarians should be appalled at, which Trump has done. But there are so many examples of each one that I won't be able to name all of the examples of these violations. But this is one of the problems, is that a new scandal, a new bit of news, a new violation that of the Trump administration or of Trump himself happens so often that they each just go by, just whiz by us, and each scandal is gone and forgotten when the next one comes up. And he does it so often that this is one of the major problems, is we can't even look at each of them. Now, you could also say that he's exposing a lot of the problems in American institutions. And there is some truth to that, because so much of the presidency is about the culture, the expectations, sort of an honor system, especially for the president, because very few laws can really be applied against the president while in office compared with other officials. And maybe this needs to be changed, and Trump is exposing it. But it wasn't necessary until now, because presidents prior have always been worried about what it'll look like, They were worried about the optics of violating these cultural norms, but Trump is not worried about that, and he just violates new ones every day, and people forget about the old ones to a certain extent. But I do think it's coming back to haunt him right now, but that's a whole nother story. So what if this means that the presidency can be turned into an authoritarian, maybe an oligarchic state quite easily if a president just violates these norms and takes advantage of this sort of honor system and makes use of it? Well, this is a real worry, because Trump has taken steps in that direction, and if he were to get reelected, he would have even fewer things holding him back. And he's already shown in these last few years that he is willing to take more and more and more steps the more he gets away with. And the Republican Party so far, up until at least recently, maybe still, has just gone along with him with everything that he does, which means that he gets away with it, and he pushes the boundaries further, and he pushes it like a child, like sort of pushing and pushing to see what they can get away with. So Trump is dangerous, I think, but let's talk about some specifics, all right? And we'll start out with some of the basic libertarian arguments for him. So a lot of libertarians I talk to talk about deregulation. They say Trump maybe has, talked bad crap and done, and said bad things, but he's done some really good things in action, such as taking steps to deregulate the economy, or to deregulate in general. But I think there's a big distinction there, to deregulate on the economy and to deregulate in general. So libertarians, academic libertarians looking at the problems, tend to prioritize what kinds of deregulations are most important. And I think for most libertarians, it's economic regulations, things that impose an economic cost and are trying to do things for an economic reason, which really can't be supported when you use a sort of a free market or an Austrian approach to understanding the economy, such as based on supply and demand, basic things that, someone who's actually looking at the economy can understand. A market system works with supply and demand, and when a government imposes something, an economic regulation, whether it's a minimum wage or, another kind of price control, or intervenes to create a monopoly or to subsidize one thing against another, etc. When those kinds of things are imposed in an economy, they always have side effects, right? They always have unintended consequences. So when libertarians look at regulations that do those kinds of economic things, I'm totally with them, absolutely. And those are the high priority for libertarians academically, because they understand that those have the most severe consequences. But let's look at the deregulation that Trump has actually done, all right? So he has deregulated a number of things, but for the most part, those things are about making it easier for companies to pollute. And these are companies that already have an advantage through subsidies and through other government help. All right? And those regulations against them polluting were there to protect individuals. And now, libertarians often say that we don't need regulations to stop pollution because property rights would do it. That's an academic argument, but we don't have property rights for those people. Right? So if we had property rights over the air we breathe, the water we drink, and so on and so forth, then removing regulations might work, right? But we don't. So the people who are breathing that air, drinking that water, and everything else, those people are not being protected by having property rights over it, okay? The property rights are owned by a company that also has political connections, has nobody competing against it in the market, and simply wants to pollute so that it's cheaper for them. Okay, so taking away these regulations without replacing it with something else is only hurting people and helping a company, but helping a company that shouldn't be helped in this case, because they have a government granted monopoly generally, and or at least subsidies or some other protections, and have no real competition, and certainly no competition from anyone who is pointing out that they're poisoning the people and trying to stop them and trying to actually provide proper competition in a real market sense, the way that libertarians and Austrians and others sometimes argue should be happening and would be happening had we a free market. So you have to take the existing conditions in which we live, the context, which is something Austrians and complexity theorists and everyone should understand, right? The context of the situation before you try to apply a simplistic model. So the simple model, the Coastian theory, the simple models, right, about how private property rights could help to ensure that everyone is okay without these regulations don't apply if we don't have those property rights, if we don't have those protections. So today there are a number of cities in the U.S. where the water is dangerous to drink. Flint, Michigan became famous for this, but it's happening in many more cities now. And this is in part because of the recent regulations that were removed by the Trump administration without replacing them with something that actually helps. Okay, so I'm not saying the arguments of libertarians are wrong, but simply there are no property rights in place, so they're irrelevant. It makes the arguments irrelevant. And removing regulations without those protections makes basic health safety a real problem, and government can and should protect basic safety of people if nothing else can. Okay, that's a basic function of the government. If that's not an overreach, it's a basic function. Okay, so other regulations may have gone too far. Trump administration may have rolled back some regulations that went too far, may have done some good, but the vast majority of them appear to be not like that. Okay, so if they were a burden and had no good rationale, then great. I'm glad that he rolled them back. But it doesn't seem like most of them were about that. It seems like most of them were protecting corporations that had a real connection to government already, and that he was doing for that reason. Which brings us to our next point, which is about Trump's connection with corporations and why he actually did this deregulation and why he did many other things, which was because he actually didn't drain the swamp. He really has a greater tie to these corporations, to supporting them with government funding, government handouts, government favors, preferences, and so on, which is not what libertarians are supposed to be about. It's great that corporations can exist on their own, but if they're being supported by government, helped, if government is picking winners and is giving them subsidies, that's not what libertarianism is about. So we'll start with the tax cut and how it helped corporations, because of course, reducing corporate tax rates in general could help consumers, absolutely, could boost the economy, absolutely, but that's not what Trump's tax cut actually did, right? So through a series of obscure regulations that the Treasury carved out, exceptions to the law during the tax cuts, it meant that leading American and foreign companies will owe little or nothing in new taxes on offshore profits. This is already a problem before, but this was something that was increased during the Trump tax cut. So letting companies off the hook for tens of billions of taxes that they normally would have been required to pay was slipped in and was not something, it was something that's special for big corporations. So again, it hurts small businesses. So the tax cut did that in many different ways. And in general, it didn't help regular people, but actually helped donors and specific groups. So although Steve Mnuchin had claimed that there will be no tax cut for the upper class, in fact, they got most of the benefit, at least 40% of the benefit. Jared Kushner is tied up in dozens of real estate pass-throughs and stands to save $4 million annually personally through his businesses. About 70% of the pass-through goes to the top 1%. It also helps Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump Jr., and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who is known for getting absolutely, specific help for herself and her family. She could save at least $2 million on this, and wealthy members of Congress also are receiving a lot from it. So again, this is not new, but is certainly something that Trump has continued. And this is something that we see all over the place, that the Trump administration has claimed to clean up corruption, but no, he's absolutely continuing and enhancing the special benefits that big corporations get at the expense of small business, at the expense of competition. The coronavirus stimulus was absolutely even much worse. It was the biggest, more than any prior stimulus package, much worse than Obama's, and absolutely going towards his friends and connections and corporate donors. He's just absolutely continuing it, not draining the swamp. Okay? Speaking of handouts to corporations, Trump has also been more personally corrupt than previous presidents, and has put into his administration, his own family, Wall Street, and his corporate donors. He's also helped to prop up corporations in many ways through subsidies and in many other ways, many favors from government. And these are the monopolies that exist because of government help. So libertarians frequently talk about how monopolies are not possible without the help of government. Fine, I will concede that, right? I've written about this, all right? Let's assume that there's not even any kind of natural monopoly or anything like that, that it's purely because of government that monopolies exist. Fine. Okay? But that's irrelevant because the corporations are getting a huge amount of help from the government, more so than ever under Trump and this Republican Party. Okay? So companies like Monsanto, who extract money from small farmers, who can no longer regrow their crops using their seeds, right? Because Monsanto has changed the way that the seeds work with genetic engineering, which I have nothing against genetic engineering of crops if it's done for the right reasons and it helps. It's certainly helped millions of people, billions of people around the world. I have no problem with that. But when they make it so that you have to come back to them and buy new seeds each year, and they do this and they are able to continue doing this because of help from government, there I have a problem with it, as should all libertarians, right? If they're being honest. Okay? So it's not just Monsanto or just the food, industry. It's everything, right? Across the board in America. It's becoming much like oligarchic economies around the world, where a few companies are able to control all the different industries, all the different markets. And it's because they are getting help from government. And this has continued and expanded through Trump. And now I fully agree that Obama continued previous administrations, George W. Bush administration policies that were horrible. Absolutely, I agree, right? But Trump is continuing these previous policies that support corporations, make them monopolies, give them subsidies, give them specialized preferential tax treatment, etc., and allow them to hide their profits from taxation. And when it's done specifically like that to help corporations, it is hurting small business and it is hurting competition. Okay? So we can look back actually to Robert Bork, who a lot of libertarians like. But he did a re-understanding of antitrust laws that decided that monopolies were okay so long as they kept prices low. But that means monopolies that were being helped by government, that were getting subsidies and preferential treatment by government, could continue to do what they wanted to do as long as they kept prices low. And then this same reinterpretation said that, well, if they're big, then they're efficient and therefore they're keeping prices low. So this was a sneaky way to help these monopolies stay in power despite getting all kinds of preferential treatment from government and even despite how they treated customers. Okay, now I've been trying to deal with this quickly, but I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So, if you think the economy is an important issue as a libertarian, you should care about the coronavirus response. Now, you may not think it's a big deal, and you also may not think that the president has much to do with it. But in actual fact, the Founding Fathers did recognize the role for the government in something like a public health crisis and put things in place for that, and also expected the president to be a leader. Otherwise, why would they even create the office of the president to begin with? Now, that doesn't mean that he should clamp down on everyone, or even, have a federal mask mandate or anything like that. That would be clamping down, right? That would be maybe too harsh. However, as a leader, he could still try to usher people in the right direction. And why would we want to do that? Maybe it's not even that much worse than the flu. Well, it's a new virus. We don't know that much about it even now, and we certainly didn't at the start, and there were mistakes made. But as a new thing that is on top of the normal flu, it has killed 140,000 Americans by now, and there is something a leader could do to prevent it from getting that bad and to prevent it from getting even worse as the virus continues to rampage through the economy and the people and the lives. Even if you don't care that much about the lives lost, I mean, you should, as life, liberty, and property are the basic fundamental rights that people have. But, all right, you can't blame that all on government. However, the government can still do something. For one thing, they can do testing and tracing. And right now, Trump is trying to reduce testing and tracing. And that's going to make it much more difficult for the economy to get back on track. Okay. Now, that's all I'll say about that. But so now let's look at the list of unconstitutional things that Trump has done to undermine institutions, to violate the basic balance of power, separation of power that the Constitution promises the people, right? He's undermined institutions, and he's, for example, even used federal cops against protesters, tear gas and gases like that, and rubber bullets and whatever against protesters, right? That's a violation of freedom of speech and assembly in the worst possible way, okay? But there's been a whole list of things that he's done to undermine law enforcement, undermine the basic constitutional institutions that we rely upon, the Department of Justice, the Congress. All right? The impeachment was a violation of law. It was a basic bribery or extortion plot where he used taxpayer money to try to get something that he wanted personally, right? And to do that, to undermine an ally, but not for a policy reason, but for a personal reason, which is the worst kind of undermining of what the presidency is supposed to be. And then on top of it, he shut down the investigation. He refused to allow people to come forward and to speak and to say what they knew, which is much worse than what Nixon did, okay? It was, I think, the shutting down of the investigation, which he's also done through the Department of Justice for many other things, starting from the Russia probe, but all the way through. Despite if you think that those things were badly done or even wrong in their assumptions, the president should not be able to shut those things down to prevent investigations into his own business, into what he's done as president. If we don't have that, we don't have balance of powers. We don't have any checks on the presidency, and it makes the presidency an authoritarian position. This is what libertarians should care about the most. We need to have the basic democratic institutions and keep a check on the president, to keep a check on all. As a balance of power, you need to have a check from one on the other, right? That means the Congress on the president. That means the Congress on the Department of Justice. That means the Department of Justice on the president. It means each thing needs to keep a check on the other. And he has completely undermined this and taken over, essentially, the Department of Justice. He has been helping his friends and using it against his enemies. Okay, Roger Stone is only the most recent of these. As I said at the beginning, I won't be able to touch on everything, but look it up. He has been using Bill Barr, he has been undermining all the checks that the Department of Justice has against himself and his friends. He has been allowing all of his friends to go free and has been using the Department of Justice to create investigations that are based on lies against his opponents. And now you might think, oh, it's because I don't like Trump and I like his enemies or whatever, and so I'm assuming this stuff. No, I'm not assuming it. Every investigation that he has done against his enemies has turned up empty. Even though he put his own people in place, they just simply could not find evidence to support his accusations. Meanwhile, those that went against him actually found evidence and convicted these people, like Roger Stone was convicted. All right, he wasn't convicted for everything. He was mostly convicted for refusing to share evidence, for basically obstructing justice and intimidating witnesses. And these are things that were used to cover up something underneath, most likely. Right? But even if they weren't, even if there was nothing underneath, he still obstructed justice. These things still should have been able to go through. So it's very clear that Trump and his allies have done some criminal activities and have been covering them up and using the Justice Department, using his power over the Justice Department, which he shouldn't have, because the president should not have that power, has been using that to cover up his own crimes and then also use the Department of Justice to go after his enemies. This is pure, basic authoritarianism and should be exactly what libertarians are frightened of happening. And it's exactly what is happening. And is exactly what's going to turn America into one of these crony power states that are basically filled with oligarchs and are completely unwilling to give the people and the people's vote and the balance of power any power at all, and just give the power to the president and his cronies and his allies. Now, next thing, on the draining the swamp and corruption stuff, I mean, he has been using his power that he shouldn't have, but is allowed to him because the president isn't subject to as many laws. He has also violated the emoluments clause in this. He has been funneling money to himself, whether it's by going to his own golf courses and using federal money to do it, campaign money, his own hotel. He tried to have the G7 or the G8 at his own hotel. But probably more important than that is that he has used all of the monies of the government towards his own benefit. This is exactly what the impeachment was about. Using it for his own benefit. Furthermore, every day, as I said, these things get lost because there's so many of them day after day, but most recently, he's violated the Hatch Act, which says that you're not allowed to use the Rose Garden or any of the basic presidential forums to do campaigning. And he did it so badly that, regular media had to cut him off, had to refuse to air it, because it was such a basic, obvious violation of the Hatch Act. And again, maybe we're learning something from this, but if he was allowed to continue doing this, it would be a disaster. If he had a second term, again, he's making each of these things worse. And the Hatch Act is a minor thing. But in any other presidency, we would consider it an outrage. He is doing so many of these things. He's completely undermining democracy and basic rule of law. Okay, and finally, I will get to a few final remarks. And I really do hope that you'll go back through this and look into each of these things, because as I said at the beginning, I can only cover a very small amount of each of these because there are just so many violations in each of these categories. But all right, so gassing peaceful protesters, sending in federal troops, all right, in unmarked vans, no badges, nothing identifying them in, I think it's Seattle, or is it Oregon, whatever, taking people away in these vans. Really scary stuff. Gassing the protesters in D.C. All of this stuff, this could get much worse in the next term. And where can it go in a second term? All right, if he's willing to break the law in so many different ways, how much could it get worse? How much more of an authoritarian could he possibly be if he's willing to violate all of these norms and these laws? When he sees a norm, he says, oh, well, I don't need to worry about it. It's only a norm, it's not a law, and he violates it. Okay, and his lies and distortions are also dangerous. As I said at the beginning, people say, oh, it's only words, you know, what his actions are good because he does deregulation, which, as I said earlier, deregulation, even if there's some good stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's really shouldn't happen until we fix the property rights issue, until we fix the other issues that libertarians recognize in academic circles as being important before you can deregulate, right? But even if he does some good stuff, no, his lies and distortions are dangerous, but those are, again, I've talked about many other things. They're not the only things at all. I'm only getting to this now because it's also connected to actions, okay? I've been leaving aside his words in general. But his words, his race baiting, his disinformation, and conspiracy theories are dangerous because, for example, they've made the coronavirus worse than it needed to be. They've divided Americans, and they've made Americans kind of stupider. All right? He's being outed on Fox News by Chris Wallace. Watch the recent interview. It's fantastic. Wallace fact checks him several times. But until now, Fox viewers haven't seen much of that, and that's been dangerous, all right? One of the biggest lies that he's spread is voter fraud and how vote by mail would supposedly open up the election to massive fraud. That's not true. There's no evidence of this, okay? Voter fraud has been very rare, although there have been a few incidents involving Republicans, including a Republican congressperson recently, a congressman. But in general, voting fraud has been very rare. Okay, and even in states where there have been huge amounts of vote by mail all the last decades, okay, there's been very little voter fraud. And now during coronavirus, obviously people want to vote by mail. So by not allowing this, that could be very dangerous to people's lives. And then when Chris Wallace asked him whether he would accept the election results, he refused to answer. All right, he's the president. If he thought that vote by mail was so dangerous, he could do something about it. All right? The president can't do everything, but for one thing, he could certainly, with a few months left, and he's been talking about this for ages, but with a few months left, he could help improve the system by, for example, encouraging Congress to investigate and do something about it, to do something, quickly to change it, to make it more safe. All right? There are many things that he could do, even just as a leader, by suggesting that Congress work with him and do it, so suggesting the Republican Party do it. All right? So even if you think he's a little bit inept, but, it's great that he leaves things in a decentralized manner and doesn't push them, he could still suggest it to the Republican Party, which would probably, considering how much they go along with him, would probably spur them to action. And they could do something in the Congress and in the Senate. And I'm sure the Democrats would go along with it. If it was a matter of just making things safer, that would be something he could do. Okay? Why is he not doing it? And by the way, that speaks to libertarians often think, oh, the president can't do something. He can lead, and leading is important, despite what libertarians say. So why isn't he doing that? Why isn't he acting as a leader in the coronavirus or in the voter fraud thing or in any of these other things? I think it's because he doesn't care about it. If he actually cared about, making sure that voting was safe, he could have done something about it, even just by tweeting about it, just by talking about it in a different way, saying, let's please make it a bit safer, rather than just trying to condemn it and saying you can't have vote by mail even though there's a pandemic and people are worried about it. And even if you're not worried about it, other people are. So Are you just going to say they shouldn't be able to vote if they're worried about it? All right, so if he really cared about it, he could make something happen, but he doesn't. And that's the fundamental thing, is he's not a good faith actor. He's lying, and he's lying on purpose, and he's doing it for a reason, and it's all personal reasons. It's his own personal benefit that he's interested in. Okay, and I wouldn't say that, I don't say that about anyone. I would never even said it about Lenin, all right? I said he was an ideological person and he believed in what he believed in. I don't ever say this. In fact, you can look in my history, I've never said this about anyone else, because in general, I don't like to make assumptions. I like to take people at their word, just as I take libertarians at their word, that they care about what they say and that they believe in the ideals that they say they believe in. This is the only time I can think of that I've ever said that. But in Trump's case, I think there's enough evidence that he cares about himself. Now, he might also be working for Putin, I don't know, but I'm not going to say that. But I will say that he seems to only care about himself. He doesn't care about the issues like voter fraud as a real issue. Maybe he's just convinced by Fox News, but I don't think so. I mean, that would mean that Fox News is completely controlling him, and that may be possible. I don't know. Like I said, I don't like to make these assumptions, but it does seem like Trump doesn't really care about these issues. He is using them for personal benefit, and right now he's unwilling to say that he will accept the election results. And that is frightening. And what would it mean if he had a second term? Because he's gotten so much more willing to violate laws and norms in just the few years that he's been in power. If he got another 4 years, how many more norms, how many more things would he violate? How much more authoritarian would he become? And that is a serious issue for libertarians, if libertarians truly care about the issues that they claim to care about. That's it.